What if I told you that the most psychologically advanced fear management system in human history wasn't developed by modern therapists, but by a carpenter 2,000 years ago? Jesus of Nazareth didn't just preach about overcoming fear, he engineered a complete mental framework that modern psychology is only now beginning to understand. While millions study his spiritual teachings, they're missing the hidden psychological genius that turned ordinary fishermen into fearless leaders who changed the world. Today, we're going to reverse engineer the 3 core psychological principles Jesus used to rewire the human mind and eliminate fear at its source. Prepare to see leadership, courage, and mental mastery in a completely new light. If you're building anything meaningful in your life, the most powerful fear elimination method in history has been hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about conquering fear. Here's what most people completely misunderstand about Jesus and fear. They think he simply told people, "Don't be afraid," and somehow that magically worked. But that's not what happened at all. When you actually study the encounters, you discover something far more sophisticated. A systematic psychological methodology that would make modern cognitive behavioral therapists jealous. Take the moment when Jesus walked on water. His disciples see him approaching their boat during a storm, and they're terrified. But watch what Jesus does next. He doesn't just say, "Calm down." He doesn't minimize their fear or tell them it's irrational. Instead, he does something psychologically brilliant. He immediately reframes their entire perception of the situation. Take courage. "It is I, don't be afraid." Notice the sequence. First, he commands courage, a proactive mental state. Then he reveals his identity, giving them a new framework for understanding what they're experiencing. Only then does he address the fear directly. This isn't random. This is a calculated psychological intervention. Most people think fear is about what's happening to them, but Jesus understood something that modern neuroscience has only recently confirmed. Fear is about how we interpret what's happening to us. The same storm that terrorized the disciples one day becomes a backdrop for walking on water the next. Same circumstances, completely different psychological experience. The disciples weren't just scared of the storm. They were scared because they had no framework for understanding their circumstances. Jesus didn't change the external situation. He gave them a new internal operating system. And this is where it gets really interesting, because this pattern shows up everywhere in his interactions with people. When someone brought him a paralyzed man, Jesus didn't start with the physical healing. He started with "Your sins are forgiven," completely reframing the man's identity from broken victim to forgiven and whole. The psychological transformation came first. The physical healing was almost secondary. This reveals the first law of Jesus' fear elimination system: master the frame, master the fear. While everyone else was trying to change their circumstances, Jesus was changing how people thought about their circumstances. And once you change the frame, the fear often disappears on its own. What Jesus discovered, and what modern psychology calls cognitive reframing, is that fear is primarily a product of meaning-making, not circumstances. When someone feels overwhelmed by fear, they're not actually afraid of what's happening. They're afraid of what they think it means about their future, their safety, or their identity. Let me show you how sophisticated Jesus' understanding of this was. When he encountered the woman caught in adultery, the crowd was ready to stone her. She was experiencing multiple layers of fear: fear of death, fear of shame, fear of rejection. But Jesus didn't address any of those fears directly. Instead, he reframed the entire situation with one sentence: "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." Suddenly, the woman wasn't the only person with a problem. Everyone had a problem. The frame shifted from "punish the guilty" to "acknowledge our shared humanity." The fear evaporated because the meaning of the situation completely changed. She went from being an isolated target to being part of the human condition that everyone shared. This is psychologically brilliant because it leverages what researchers now call common humanity, one of the core components of self-compassion. When we realize that our struggles are part of the human experience rather than evidence of our personal inadequacy, fear loses its power over us. But here's where Jesus' system goes even deeper. He didn't just reframe problems as universal, he reframed people's entire identity. When he called Simon Peter, the Rock, he wasn't describing who Peter was in that moment. Peter was impulsive, inconsistent, prone to fear. Jesus was reframing Peter's identity around who he could become. Modern psychology calls this identity-based transformation, and it's incredibly powerful because it changes how someone interprets every future challenge. If you see yourself as someone who is fundamentally capable and called to greatness, the same obstacles that would terrify your old identity become opportunities for your new one to emerge. Jesus understood that sustainable courage isn't about pumping yourself up in the moment. It's about operating from a completely different sense of who you are. When your identity shifts, your relationship with fear automatically shifts with it. You're not trying to overcome fear as someone who struggles with fear. You're expressing courage as someone whose essential nature is courageous. This is why his approach was so effective with people like the disciples. He didn't just give them confidence for one situation. He gave them a new operating system that generated courage in every situation. They went from fishermen who were afraid of storms to leaders who were willing to die for their beliefs. Same people, completely different framework for understanding themselves and their circumstances. Think of fear like a movie you're watching in a dark theater. Most people try to overcome fear by closing their eyes or looking away from the screen. But Jesus discovered something more powerful. He learned how to change the entire movie by switching the projector. Your mind is constantly projecting meaning onto your circumstances, creating the movie of your experience. When you're afraid, it's usually because your mind is projecting a horror movie onto a situation that could just as easily be framed as an adventure story or a growth opportunity. Jesus was a master projectionist. He could take the same raw situation and help people see it through a completely different lens. The storm wasn't evidence that they were going to die. It was the backdrop for experiencing something miraculous. The woman's sin wasn't proof that she was worthless. It was evidence of their shared need for grace. Here's how you can apply this immediately. The next time you feel fear, ask yourself, what movie is my mind projecting right now? Then ask, what would this situation look like if I was the hero of an adventure story instead of the victim of a tragedy? This isn't positive thinking or denial. This is recognizing that your circumstances don't have inherent meaning. You assign meaning to them. And if you're going to assign meaning anyway, you might as well choose a meaning that empowers you rather than paralyzes you. Jesus understood that people aren't broken by what happens to them. They're broken by the stories they tell themselves about what happens to them. Change the story and you change everything. This is the first psychological law that made Jesus' approach so devastatingly effective. Reality is interpretation, and interpretation is choice. If this is exploding your mind, stop now and hit subscribe. What comes next will explode your view on mental mastery. But reframing was just the beginning of Jesus' psychological system. There was something else he did that was even more sophisticated, and it reveals a principle about fear that most people never discover. Here's the mystery. Why did Jesus consistently choose to get physically closer to the very things that terrified people the most? When he encountered lepers, people who were not just feared but legally required to warn others to stay away, Jesus didn't just heal them from a distance. He touched them. When he met the demon-possessed man who was so frightening that he lived alone in the tombs, Jesus didn't cast out the demons from across the lake. He got in a boat and went directly to him. This pattern shows up everywhere. When people were afraid of storms, Jesus got in the boat. When they were afraid of death, he went to the tomb. When they were afraid of powerful authorities, he walked straight into their courts. Most people try to manage fear by avoiding what scares them. Jesus did the exact opposite. He moved toward fear with intentional proximity. At first glance, this seems almost reckless. Why would someone deliberately get closer to dangerous situations? But when you understand the psychology behind this approach, you realize it's actually genius-level emotional intelligence. Modern anxiety research has discovered something called approach behavior versus avoidance behavior. When we avoid what we fear, we actually strengthen the fear. Our brain interprets avoidance as confirmation that the threat is real and dangerous. But when we approach what we fear, especially when we do it with the right mindset, something remarkable happens. The fear begins to dissolve because our brain gathers new evidence about the actual level of threat. But Jesus wasn't just practicing exposure therapy. He was doing something much more sophisticated. He was demonstrating what psychologists now call safety in presence. When someone feels afraid and alone, their fear amplifies. But when they feel afraid and accompanied by someone who is calm and confident, their nervous system begins to regulate automatically. Jesus understood that fear is not just a cognitive experience, it's a physiological one. When your nervous system is dysregulated by fear, trying to think your way out of it has limited effectiveness. But proximity to someone who embodies calm confidence triggers what's called co-regulation. Your nervous system starts to mirror the regulated state of the person next to you. This is why his physical presence was so transformative for people. He wasn't just teaching them to think differently about their circumstances. He was literally helping their bodies feel safe again. And once someone's nervous system is regulated, their capacity for courage and clear thinking returns naturally. Here's what makes Jesus' proximity principle so psychologically sophisticated. He understood that courage is not the absence of fear. It's the capacity to remain present and purposeful in the presence of fear. And presence is something you can only learn through practice in real situations. When Jesus invited Peter to walk on water, he wasn't eliminating the danger of the storm. The waves were still real. The wind was still strong. Peter could still sink. But Jesus created what psychologists call a secure base, a relationship context where someone feels safe enough to take risks and learn new capabilities. This is exactly how healthy development works in families. Children learn to be brave, not because their parents eliminate all dangers, but because their parents provide a secure relationship that makes it safe to encounter age-appropriate challenges. Jesus was essentially reparenting his disciples, giving them the secure base they needed to develop courage as adults. But the proximity principle goes even deeper than co-regulation and secure attachment. Jesus understood something about fear that modern trauma therapy is just beginning to grasp. Most fear is not actually about present circumstances. It's about unresolved fear from the past that gets triggered by present circumstances. When the disciples were afraid during storms, they weren't just afraid of that particular storm. They were carrying accumulated fear from every previous time they felt helpless and out of control. When the woman caught in adultery was terrified of being stoned, she wasn't just afraid of physical death. She was experiencing the crushing weight of shame and rejection that had been building her entire life. Jesus' proximity principle worked because it created a corrective emotional experience. Instead of having to face their fears alone, which is how they had experienced fear in the past, they got to face their fears in the presence of someone who embodied perfect love and acceptance. This didn't just help them deal with the immediate situation, it began to heal the deeper fear patterns that had been controlling their lives. Modern therapy calls this earned secure attachment. When someone who learned to be afraid through painful relationships gets to experience safety and acceptance in a new relationship, it can literally rewire their capacity for trust and courage. Jesus was essentially providing mass therapy for an entire generation of people who had learned to navigate the world through fear and self-protection. The proximity principle reveals why his approach was so much more effective than just teaching people concepts about courage. He was giving them embodied experiences of safety that their nervous systems could learn from. He was proving through his presence that it was possible to remain calm, loving, and purposeful, even in the most challenging circumstances. This is why the disciples could eventually face persecution and death with such courage. They had been conditioned through thousands of small moments of experiencing Jesus' regulated presence in the midst of chaos. Their nervous systems had learned a new way of responding to threat, not through fight, flight, or freeze, but through what Jesus modeled: compassionate engagement. Imagine fear as a wild animal that has been stalking you your entire life. Most people try to deal with this animal by building higher and higher walls to keep it away. But Jesus discovered something counterintuitive. The more walls you build, the stronger and more terrifying the animal becomes in your imagination. Instead of building walls, Jesus chose to walk straight toward the animal, but never alone. He always brought perfect love with him. And here's what he discovered. When love and fear meet in the same space, fear can't survive. Not because fear gets destroyed, but because it gets transformed into something else entirely. This is exactly what happened every time Jesus moved toward what people feared most. His presence didn't eliminate the challenging circumstances, but it eliminated the isolation that made those circumstances overwhelming. Suddenly, people weren't facing their giants alone. They were facing them accompanied by someone who embodied unshakable peace. You can apply this principle immediately. Instead of avoiding the situations that make you nervous, practice moving toward them while intentionally connecting with sources of strength, wisdom, or love. This might mean calling a mentor before a difficult conversation, praying before a challenging meeting, or simply remembering that you're not facing your fears alone. The key is proximity plus presence. Get closer to what challenges you, but do it from a connected, grounded place rather than a reactive, isolated place. Fear thrives in isolation but dissolves in authentic connection. Jesus mastered this principle so completely that his very presence became a source of courage for everyone around him. This reveals the second psychological law of Jesus' system. Courage is contagious, but only through proximity. You can't learn to be brave by avoiding brave situations. You learn to be brave by facing brave situations in the presence of someone who has already mastered fear. Jesus became that presence for thousands of people, and they became that presence for countless others. If you're watching this far, you are different. Prove it, like and subscribe for all the secrets in my next videos. But even reframing and proximity weren't the deepest parts of Jesus' psychological system. There was a third principle that was the most counterintuitive of all, and it's the one that modern psychology struggles to understand even today. Here's the mystery. Jesus' ultimate strategy for overcoming fear was teaching people how to surrender to it completely. This sounds like the opposite of everything we've been talking about. How can surrender possibly be a tool for overcoming fear? But watch what Jesus actually did when he faced his greatest moment of terror. The night before his crucifixion in the Garden of Gethsemane, the Bible records that Jesus was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, and that his sweat became like drops of blood, a medical condition called hematidrosis that only occurs under extreme psychological stress. This wasn't someone casually accepting a difficult situation. This was someone experiencing terror at the deepest possible level. But instead of fighting the fear or trying to escape it, Jesus did something that reveals the most sophisticated aspect of his psychological understanding. He surrendered to the fear completely while simultaneously surrendering to something larger than the fear. Not my will, but yours be done. This isn't passive resignation. This is what psychologists now call radical acceptance, combined with values-based action. Jesus accepted the full reality of his emotional experience without trying to change it, while simultaneously choosing to act in alignment with his deepest values, regardless of how he felt. Most people get trapped in what therapists call emotional reasoning, the belief that because they feel afraid, they should act afraid. Jesus demonstrated something radically different, the capacity to feel fear fully while acting courageously anyway. The fear didn't have to go away for the courageous action to happen. This is psychologically brilliant because it breaks the cycle that keeps most people stuck. When you're afraid and you try to fight the fear, you actually create a second layer of fear. Fear of the fear itself. You end up afraid of being afraid, which doubles your suffering and paralyzes your capacity for action. But when you surrender to fear completely, when you stop fighting it and just let it be present, something unexpected happens. The energy you were using to resist the fear becomes available for purposeful action. You can be afraid and courageous at the same time. They're not opposites. They can coexist. Jesus understood that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act according to love, even when fear is present. This is why he could face crucifixion, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he was willing to let fear be present without letting it control his choices. This principle shows up throughout his teaching. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. This isn't just spiritual metaphor. This is practical psychology. When you stop trying to protect yourself from fear, you discover that you're much more resilient than you thought. The surrender paradox reveals the deepest layer of Jesus' fear elimination system, and it's based on a psychological truth that most people never discover. Fear only has power over you when you believe you have to make it go away. The moment you stop trying to control your emotional experience, you regain control of your behavioral choices. Modern psychology calls this psychological flexibility, the ability to stay present with difficult emotions while continuing to act in ways that align with your values. But Jesus understood this principle 2,000 years before we had language for it, and he taught it in the most practical way possible through his own example. When Jesus told his disciples, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world," he wasn't promising them a life without fear. He was promising them a way to relate to fear that would make them unshakable. The troubles would still come, the fear would still arise, but it wouldn't have the final say in how they lived their lives. This is the psychological key that unlocks everything else Jesus taught about courage. When you're no longer fighting your own emotional experience, you have access to resources you didn't know you had. Your energy isn't tied up in internal conflict. Your attention isn't consumed by trying to manage your feelings. You become available for love, creativity, and purposeful action even in the most challenging circumstances. Watch how this played out in the lives of his followers. When Stephen was being stoned to death, he wasn't displaying the absence of fear. He was displaying the presence of something larger than fear. When Paul faced shipwrecks, imprisonments, and beatings, he didn't claim to feel no fear. He claimed to have learned the secret of being content in any circumstance. The surrender paradox works because it resolves the fundamental conflict that keeps most people trapped in fear cycles. When you're fighting your own emotions, you're always at war with yourself. When you're at war with yourself, you can't access your full capacity for courage, creativity, or love. But when you stop fighting your emotions and start including them in a larger framework of purpose, everything changes. Jesus demonstrated that you could feel everything: fear, sadness, anger, overwhelm, and still choose love, still choose courage, still choose to serve something greater than your own comfort and safety. This isn't emotional suppression or spiritual bypassing. This is emotional integration in service of transcendent purpose. The surrender paradox reveals why his approach created such lasting transformation in people. He wasn't teaching them to become people who don't feel fear. He was teaching them to become people who feel fear and choose love anyway. And once you learn that you can act courageously while feeling afraid, you realize that no emotion has the power to stop you from living the life you're called to live. This is the third and most powerful law of Jesus' psychological system: surrender to the feeling, act from the calling. When you stop trying to control your emotional experience and start choosing your behavioral expression, you discover a source of courage that external circumstances can't touch. Think of fear like a river that you need to cross to reach your destination. Most people stand on the bank trying to figure out how to make the river disappear before they cross it. They waste enormous amounts of energy building dams, digging channels, or just standing there hoping the water will dry up. But Jesus discovered something revolutionary. You don't have to make the river disappear to cross it. You just have to stop fighting the river and start swimming with purpose. The water might be cold, the current might be strong, but you can still move toward your destination. In fact, trying to fight the river will exhaust you. Learning to work with the river while maintaining your direction will get you across. This is exactly how surrender works with fear. You stop trying to make the fear go away and start learning how to move forward while the fear is present. The fear might still be there, but it's no longer stopping you from taking action. You've learned to swim. Here's how to apply this immediately. The next time you feel afraid of something you know you need to do, try this experiment. Instead of waiting for the fear to go away, say, "I notice I'm feeling afraid, and I'm going to do this anyway." Then take one small action while the fear is still present. You'll discover something remarkable. Action is possible, even when fear is present. Courage isn't a feeling, it's a choice. And once you realize you can choose courage, even when you feel afraid, you've discovered the secret that made Jesus and his followers unstoppable. The surrender paradox reveals the ultimate psychological truth. You were never meant to control your emotions. You were meant to feel them fully and choose your response consciously. When you stop trying to manage your feelings and start managing your choices, you access a level of freedom and power that external circumstances can't touch. This is why Jesus could face crucifixion, why his disciples could face persecution, and why millions of people throughout history have found unshakable courage through his example. They learned that surrender isn't defeat. It's the doorway to a kind of strength that fear can't penetrate. Here's how these three laws work together to create the most powerful fear elimination system in human history. First, Jesus reframed every situation from threat to opportunity, giving people a new lens for interpreting their circumstances. Second, he moved toward what people feared most, proving that love and fear cannot coexist in the same space. Third, he surrendered completely to difficult emotions while acting from transcendent purpose, showing that courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of something greater. Together, these principles don't just help you overcome fear, they transform fear into fuel for extraordinary living. When you master the frame, embrace proximity and practice surrender, you discover what Jesus demonstrated: that the same challenges that break some people are the exact experiences that forge others into unshakable sources of courage and love. If these secrets exploded your mind, you need my next videos. But only if you hit the bell, otherwise you'll miss the most powerful secrets in history. What's your opinion on these ideas? Comment below. Send this to your most perceptive friend. This analysis is speculative and based on publicly available historical and textual information, not clinical diagnosis. These interpretations represent psychological parallels drawn from historical accounts and should not be considered definitive psychological assessment.